Most people think wealth announces itself. They think it arrives wearing a louder watch, a shinier car, a bigger kitchen, a better zip code, and a vacation photo taken at the exact angle that makes strangers a little jealous. That is not how I have seen real wealth behave. Real wealth is often so quiet in the beginning that the person building it does not even feel rich. He feels restrained. He feels a little different from the crowd. He feels as though he is saying no more often than other people. He feels as though his life is not yet matching the level of income he worked hard to reach. He may even feel behind. And that is exactly why so many people miss the turning point. They are waiting for wealth to feel dramatic. It usually feels disciplined first. I have lived long enough to notice that people often do not recognize the most important improvements in their lives because those improvements happen internally before they become visible externally. The same is true with money. A person is often getting richer long before he feels rich. He just does not know how to read the signs. That is what I want to talk about. Not because I enjoy turning every part of life into a financial metaphor. I do it because money, handled correctly, changes much more than a bank balance. It changes how a man experiences pressure. It changes how much of his mind is available for things other than survival. It changes the kind of work he can walk away from, the sort of nonsense he can decline, the people he can help, the future he can imagine. And the strangest part is that when this transformation begins, it rarely looks like wealth. It looks like restraint. It looks like systems. It looks like fewer excuses. It looks like a quieter life. The first sign you are quietly getting rich is that you have stopped trying to make your life look expensive. That sounds smaller than it is. Most people never do this. They merely learn to finance appearances more efficiently. They get a raise and immediately ask which part of the visible life can now be upgraded. The apartment, the car, the wardrobe, the restaurants, the vacations, the little subscription comforts that accumulate into one large financial anesthesia. There is nothing particularly evil in any one of those things. The problem is what they reveal. A person still governed by display is not yet directing money. He is responding to pressure, pressure from comparison, pressure from habit, pressure from the old primitive fear that if the world does not see some evidence of advancement, then perhaps the advancement was not real. That is a childish fear. A mature person begins to understand something different. Enough is not a number. It is a decision. Once you understand that, the economics of your entire life change. A man earning $75,000 who spends $55,000 and quietly lets the gap widen is behaving very differently from a man earning the same amount and spending $80,000 because every increase in income gets absorbed by image, comfort, and habit. That gap between income and spending is not a detail. It is the beginning of power. I have watched this for decades. A person living below his means in an intentional way is not depriving himself. He is manufacturing room, room to save, room to invest, room to survive a bad season, room to say no, room to think. That room becomes freedom later, but in the beginning, it simply feels like refusing to join the competition to look successful. Most people cannot stand that feeling for very long. They need external proof too badly. That is why the first sign of quiet wealth is psychological before it is mathematical. You stop needing strangers to co-sign your standard of living. You stop buying evidence. That is an enormous shift. The second sign is that you begin thinking in long stretches rather than short emotional bursts. This also sounds modest until you see how rare it is. The average person is trapped in near-term weather, the next paycheck, the next bonus, the next tax refund, the next hot stock, the next dip, the next deal, the next side hustle. He is always reaching toward the next visible event that promises relief or acceleration. That is not strategy. That is financial shortness of breath. A person quietly getting rich begins to think differently. He begins asking what a decision will look like in 10 years rather than 10 days. He begins asking whether the money can keep reproducing after it leaves his hands. He becomes less impressed by quick wins because he has finally understood the one force that makes ordinary people wealthy if they do not interfere with it too often. Compounding. Compounding is one of the few things in life that remains just as powerful. Now, as it was when I was young, and almost no one respects it enough while it is still small. That is because compounding is disrespectful in the early years. It does not flatter you, it does not clap for your discipline. It grows in a way too quiet for impatient people, so they abandon it. Then later they envy the result they themselves would not sit still long enough to earn. I have seen one man invest $500 every month into broad index funds and barely check the account because he understood the point was not entertainment but accumulation, while another jumped from one fashionable opportunity to another and never stayed anywhere long enough to benefit from multiplication. 20 years later, the first man did not merely have more money, he had a completely different temperament. That is what long-term thinking really buys. It buys a calmer relationship to uncertainty. When you begin thinking in decades, you stop asking the market to entertain you quarterly. When you begin thinking in decades, you stop demanding that every move feel brilliant. When you begin thinking in decades, you stop behaving as though the next year must justify the whole plan. That is a sign of wealth even before the account gets large, because time horizon itself is a form of advantage. The third sign is that you have built a financial buffer, and you are no longer living emotionally at the edge. Now here I want to be very precise. I am not talking about fantasy wealth. I am not talking about millions. I am talking about breathing room. Breathing room is one of the most valuable things money can buy, and it often arrives long before the flashy version of wealth appears. 3 to 6 months of expenses set aside in a sensible place can change a person's posture toward life more than an extra $10,000 of annual income that disappears immediately into spending. Why? Because a buffer is not only cash, it is emotional distance from panic. A person with no reserve lives in immediate negotiation with reality. Every surprise becomes a threat, a dead alternator, a dental bill, a weak month at work, a medical copay, a rise in rent, a family request. Everything becomes a small referendum on survival. That is exhausting. It shrinks the mind. It makes people reactive, short-sighted, and ashamed in ways the outside world usually cannot see. A reserve changes all of that, not because it solves every problem, because it stops every problem from becoming a crisis. I once watched two men endure almost the same inconvenience with almost opposite emotional consequences. The first man's laptop died on a Thursday afternoon. He bought a new one on Friday morning, transferred his files, and kept working. The second man's laptop died too, but he had almost nothing liquid. The purchase went on a credit card. The minimum payment became another monthly drag. He felt anger, then embarrassment, then resentment, then exhaustion. The broken machine was the same. The balance sheet was not. That is the hidden power of a reserve. Most people only understand this after a crisis. The wiser ones build the buffer before it arrives. That is why I have no patience for the phrase cash is trash when it is used by people who do not yet have enough liquidity to keep ordinary life from turning into a chain of forced bad decisions. Cash left idle forever may indeed be lazy. Strategic cash is not lazy. Strategic cash protects the portfolio, protects the household, and protects the mind. If you already have enough saved that a broken appliance, a temporary job interruption, or an ugly month no longer makes your pulse quicken, you are already richer than you may feel. The fourth sign is subtler still. You start making more money without feeling the need to convert that increase into a visible lifestyle expansion. This is one of the true dividing lines in adult finance. A person gets a raise. What happens next? For most people, the answer is automatic. The standard rises. The apartment gets better. The car gets nicer. The spending gets looser. The obligations multiply. Then the person says he still never seems to get ahead. even though his income improved. Of course he does not. The improvement was consumed by identity maintenance before it ever reached the balance sheet. The person quietly getting rich behaves differently. A raise arrives. The first question is not what can I buy now? The first question is how much of this increase can go directly into the machine. That is a very different mentality. It is the difference between using income growth to look upgraded and using income growth to become stronger. I have seen one man go from $60,000 a year to $80,000 and continue living close to the old standard, sending the extra difference into investments and reserves until the account became meaningful. I have seen another make the same jump and immediately lease the nicer car, move to the more expensive building, and expand the whole cost structure until the raise disappeared without leaving a trace. The second man felt successful faster. The first man became powerful faster. That is the difference. People always ask why some middle-income families seem surprisingly calm and income families seem constantly cornered. This is often the reason. One lets raises become assets. The other lets raises become obligations. If you are beginning to experience income growth and finding that the extra money is quietly flowing into investments rather than public upgrades, that is a sign of deep progress, whether the outside world notices or not. The fifth sign is that comparison has lost its grip on you. This one may be the most important psychological shift of all, because comparison is the tax collector of modern life. It arrives everywhere. A colleague buys the truck. A friend takes the trip. A neighbor renovates the kitchen. A cousin posts the resort. Someone your age appears to live in a cleaner, newer, brighter version of existence, and suddenly your own reasonable life begins feeling insufficient. This is one of the fastest ways to go broke. Not through greed in the classic sense, through social imitation. Most visible wealth is either exaggerated, debt-funded, or purchased at the expense of someone's future peace. People do not post the financing terms. They do not post the revolving balance. They do not post the retirement contributions. They stop to create the image. They do not post the stomachache they feel when the monthly fixed costs arrive. They post the truck. They post the water view. They post the receipt from Greece. Then weaker minds take out loans against their own future just to avoid feeling left behind by a story that was incomplete to begin with. One man sees a friend's $60,000 truck and simply hopes it makes the friend happy. Another sees it and immediately feels pressed to upgrade his own vehicle, eventually financing a $50,000 purchase at 7% and discovering 2 years later that he is upside down, stressed, and still not happier. That is how comparison turns into poverty. The moment another person's spending stops acting like an instruction to your nervous system, you have crossed a very important invisible line. That is why I like the phrase immune to marketing. If you no longer feel your life being dragged by peer pressure, by advertisements, by financial envy, by fear of missing out, then something very important has happened. You have become harder to manipulate. That is a sign of wealth even before the account becomes large. Because a mind no longer easily moved by comparison can finally begin allocating money according to values instead of theater. The sixth sign is that money is no longer the main character in your daily thoughts. This is one of my favorite signals because it reveals not extravagance but system quality. A broke person does not merely have less money. He has less silence. Money intrudes everywhere. Lunch becomes arithmetic. Rent becomes arithmetic. Every decision drags a little cloud of calculation behind it. That sort of life is mentally expensive. A quietly wealthy person often does not talk about money much at all, not because he disrespects it, but because the system now handles most of the work. Automatic contributions, automated bill pay, a reserve, a portfolio that is diversified enough not to require hourly emotional maintenance, periodic rebalancing, low-friction habits. That is how money becomes background rather than drama. And that shift is not trivial. It means the structure now serves the life instead of the life constantly serving the structure. The difference between a person whose finances require constant management because the system is weak and a person whose finances run quietly enough that he can think about family, projects, meaning, and larger questions is one of the deepest differences in adult life. People often misunderstand this and think the person no longer talking about money must not care about it. No, he cared enough to systematize it. That is a much more mature form of care. An anxious man obsessed with credit card rewards, tiny deals, and constant optimization may think he is financially engaged. Often he is just stuck in the mental life of scarcity. A man with automatic investing, a rational reserve, a diversified portfolio, and a once-a-year rebalance may look almost boring from the outside. That is usually a very good sign. Boring money often produces an exciting life. Exciting money usually produces a life full of damage control. The seventh sign is that you begin valuing time more than display. This is where real wealth often becomes visible internally before the bank statement makes the case obvious to others. A poor person is often forced into a very cruel equation: time for money, hour by hour, shift by shift, errand by errand. Life becomes a sequence of tasks and recoveries. Then a subtle shift happens as finances stabilize. The person starts realizing that money is not mainly for buying objects. It is for buying back time, time to think, time to say no, time to leave space on the calendar, time to outsource low-value friction, time to spend on children, health, reading, building, resting, or simply not being in a rush. I have seen a man spend $150 a month to have his apartment cleaned and gain back 3 hours that he then spent with his children or on work he actually cared about. I have seen another insist on doing every small task himself to save money, wearing busyness as a badge while quietly becoming exhausted and resentful. The first man was not wasteful. He had finally understood what money was for. That is the important shift. The wealthy man is not always the one who hates spending. Often he is the one who has learned what not to spend time on. That is a very sophisticated form of wealth. You do not need to own a yacht to feel it. You need enough margin and enough confidence to stop glorifying busyness and start protecting your hours. A person who craves slowness, space, and white room on the calendar is often already beginning to think like someone with capital. Not because he is lazy, because he now understands that a life can be consumed by low-grade urgency just as surely as an account can be consumed by fees. The eighth sign is perhaps the deepest. You stop making excuses and start taking ownership. When this shift happens, the language changes first. That is how you notice it. The broke mind says, "I cannot afford that." The strengthening mind says, "That is not a priority right now." The broke mind says, "Rent is impossible. Student loans are unfair. The economy is broken. Nobody can get ahead." Some of those things may be partly true. The problem is not the observation. The problem is using the observation as a final explanation rather than a starting constraint. The quietly wealthy mind does not deny reality. It simply refuses to hand all agency over to it. I have seen a man earning $65,000 in a high-cost city choose roommates, a bicycle, and meal prep. Not because life was easy, but because he had decided his investment portfolio mattered more than looking upgraded right away. I have seen another man with the same income spend years explaining why saving was impossible and end up with almost nothing besides stories. The difference was not the city. It was not the headline economy. It was ownership. Ownership is one of the most powerful financial forces in the world. Not stock ownership alone, psychological ownership, the moment you stop speaking as though life is happening to you and begin acting as though your response is the deciding variable. Everything changes. That does not mean you become delusional. It does not mean every problem is self-inflicted. It means you stop using imperfect conditions as permission for inaction. That is how quiet wealth gets, not under perfect skies, under ordinary inconvenient, often unfair conditions handled by a person who has decided to keep building anyway. Now, if you step back from all 8 of these signs, a larger pattern appears. They are not really separate signs. They are one transformation seen from 8 different angles. Living below your means is restraint. Thinking long-term, building a buffer is prudence. Resisting lifestyle inflation is discipline. Escaping comparison is independence. Making money background noise is system design. Valuing time is maturity. Taking ownership is agency. Put together, those 8 qualities form a very particular kind of person. A person who is difficult to sell to, difficult to pressure, difficult to shame, difficult to stampede, difficult to manipulate with urgency, envy, or hype. That sort of person may still live in an ordinary apartment. He may still drive an older car. He may still feel from the inside that he is simply being responsible and not yet anything special. And yet the foundations are there. That is what I want people to notice. Because if they do not notice it, they often interrupt it. A person may already be quietly getting rich and still sabotage himself because the wealth does not yet feel like what he was culturally taught to expect. He does not feel rich enough, so he upgrades too early. He does not feel successful enough, so he starts spending for visibility. He does not feel the result, so he starts taking bigger risks just to create emotional proof. That is how people ruin beautiful beginnings. Do not do that. If you recognize 1 or 2 of these signs in yourself, that is already meaningful. If you recognize 4 or 5, then the machine is probably working far better than your emotions currently admit. If you recognize most of them, then the truth is simple. You are not merely surviving. You are building a life with increasing freedom, increasing room, and increasing ownership over your own future. That is wealth. Not the noisy kind, the durable kind, the kind that is hard to photograph and hard to take from you because it does not live mainly in objects. It lives in systems. It lives in habits. It lives in a calmer nervous system. It lives in a lower level of dependence on other people's approval. It lives in a future that no longer frightens you in quite the same way. And that kind of wealth often arrives before the visible world has any idea what is happening, which is fine by me. I have always liked wealth better when it works quietly. Quiet wealth gives you options before it gives you status. Quiet wealth makes your life simpler before it makes your car nicer. Quiet wealth lowers the temperature inside your mind before it changes how others see you. That is how it should be, because the point is not to look rich first. The point is to become strong first. Strength can handle visibility later if it wants to. Visibility without strength becomes debt with prettier packaging. So if it does not feel like you are getting rich yet, but you see these internal shifts taking place, take that seriously. If spending is more intentional, if the gap is widening, if compounding matters more to you than excitement, if you have breathing room, if raises are becoming investments rather than upgrades, if comparison is losing power, if money is fading into the background because systems are now carrying it, if time is becoming more precious than display, if your language is changing from blame to ownership, then you are already on the road most people never even find. The world may not applaud it. That is all right. The world often notices wealth too late, and for the wrong reasons anyway. What matters is that you notice what is quietly happening before you sabotage it. Keep going, keep building, and let the loud people have their noise. There is a great deal of money in silence if you know how to listen to it.